It was the age of glory and ruin, the time of kings and queens, where destinies were shaped not only by bloodlines and crowns, but by the fierce desires and unyielding ambitions of those who sought to change the course of history. On the cold stone floors of Westminster Abbey and the lavish courtrooms of Whitehall, secrets were whispered, promises broken, and lives forever altered. Among these entangled lives, one love triangle would alter the religious and political landscape of an entire nation. This is the story of King Henry VIII, his steadfast but tragically doomed marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and his passionate and often reckless affair with the enchanting Anne Boleyn. It is a tale of love and betrayal, faith and treachery, where the power of the crown is balanced against the weight of the heart. The year was 1525, and England stood on the precipice of a revolution that would shake the foundations of Christendom itself. While the king's heart had turned to a new flame, the consequences of this desire would burn across generations, leaving nothing untouched. In this crucible of power, faith, and passion, the fates of Catherine and Henry would be forever intertwined in love, in war, and in the birth of a new kingdom. Catherine of Aragon stood at the edge of the English coast, the sea breeze tousling her dark, raven hair as she gazed out at the unfamiliar land before her. The year was 1501, and this was her first sight of England, a country she would come to know intimately, for better or worse. She had been a princess all her life, raised in the opulent courts of Spain, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, two monarchs who, through their cunning and relentless ambition, had carved out a powerful kingdom in the heart of Europe. But now, at the age of 15, she was leaving behind her homeland, her family, and everything she had ever known to marry a man she had yet to meet, Prince Arthur of England. Her marriage had been arranged years before, a diplomatic alliance between Spain and England, meant to secure peace between the two nations and to strengthen their position against the rising power of France. Catherine had been promised to Arthur, the eldest son of King Henry VII of England, and from the moment she had first been told of the match, it had been her duty, her destiny, to marry him. But as Catherine sailed toward the distant shores of England, she could not shake the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She had heard little of her future husband. She had been taught of his royal lineage, his noble heritage, but no one had told her about his character, his habits, or his soul. Would he be kind? Would he be generous? Or would he, too, be another man bound by the expectations of kings and politics? A man who would see her not as a woman but as a mere pawn in the game of crowns and alliances. Her thoughts were interrupted as the ship docked at Plymouth. There, a grand procession awaited her, and Catherine was ushered into the royal court, where a sea of faces, many unfamiliar, regarded her with interest and curiosity. But among them, one face stood out, a young man, no older than she, with bright, inquisitive eyes and a warm, yet distant smile. This was Arthur, the Prince of Wales. She had heard much of him in the letters sent from her parents, but now that she saw him in person, she realized how little she truly knew of him. Arthur was a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his bearing royal and noble, but there was something about him that made Catherine's heart sink. His eyes, though full of curiosity, lacked the spark of life she had hoped to find in her future husband. He seemed distant, lost in his own world, as though he were not truly present in the moment. Catherine's first impression of Arthur was one of polite indifference, an impression that would only deepen as their marriage approached. For the next several months, Catherine was immersed in the rituals of court life, learning the ways of her new home and preparing for her marriage to Arthur. The court of England was very different from the splendor and grandeur of the Spanish court, and Catherine struggled to adjust. The food was foreign to her, the customs strange, and the language at times a barrier, but she persevered, determined to fulfill her duty as a princess and future queen. Her marriage to Arthur took place in the autumn of 1501, a grand ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral. It was a momentous occasion, not only for the couple but for the entire nation. As it sealed the alliance between Spain and England, Catherine was beautiful in her wedding gown, her dark eyes bright with anticipation. Though deep inside, she felt a gnawing uncertainty. The wedding night, however, was not what she had expected. Arthur, despite his outward charm, was a reluctant husband. He seemed more interested in his own thoughts than in the woman he had married. When Catherine approached him in their chambers, she found him distant, his body cold and unresponsive to her touch. They shared little in the way of conversation, and the marriage was never consummated. Over the following months, Catherine became increasingly concerned. Arthur's health began to deteriorate, and rumors began to swirl that he was sickly, suffering from a condition that no one seemed willing to speak of openly. Catherine, devoted to her duty, cared for him as best as she could, though the strain of their marriage took a toll on her spirit. She was a woman in a foreign land, married to a man who seemed increasingly fragile, both in body and in heart. By the spring of 1502, Prince Arthur died, his body ravaged by a mysterious illness that no one could fully understand. The news of his death struck Catherine like a thunderclap, leaving her devastated and uncertain of what the future would hold. The marriage, though never truly consummated, had been a political union, an alliance that had united two powerful kingdoms. With Arthur's death, Catherine was left in a precarious position. She was a widow at a young age, and in the eyes of the court, she was now a woman without a future. It was at this moment, however, that fate intervened in a way Catherine could never have predicted. Henry VIII, the younger brother of Arthur, stepped forward. At the time, Henry was just 10 years old, a child who had not yet begun to understand the weight of the crown that would one day be his. But with his brother's death, Henry became the heir to the throne of England, and the political landscape shifted once again. As Catherine navigated the grief of losing her husband, she was forced to face the harsh realities of court life. She had been raised to be a queen, to stand by the side of a king, but now her position was uncertain. She was a widow, a woman alone in a foreign land, and her future was in the hands of the very king who had promised her to his brother. It was Henry VII, her father-in-law, who first suggested that Catherine marry Henry, his son. The alliance between Spain and England remained a valuable one, and the English court could not afford to lose it. But Catherine, though deeply loyal to the crown of Spain, was torn. She had loved Arthur, even if their marriage had been short-lived and unfulfilled. How could she marry his brother? How could she take another man as her husband, knowing that their union would be fraught with political significance rather than genuine affection? First, Catherine refused the offer. She held fast to the memory of her late husband, and the idea of marrying his brother seemed unimaginable. But Henry VII, ever the shrewd monarch, was determined to secure the alliance. The pressure mounted on Catherine, and eventually, after much deliberation and the urging of her family, she agreed to marry Henry. The union of Catherine and Henry VIII was forged not in the fires of passion, but in the cold calculations of politics. Catherine, despite her deep reluctance, fulfilled her duty. The marriage was a blend of duty, obligation, and the desire to maintain the peace between two powerful nations. But as Catherine and Henry stood before the altar, the weight of their shared history hung heavy between them, a history filled with loss, duty, and the complex dance of royal expectations. Catherine had never expected to fall in love. After all, hers was a marriage forged from diplomacy, not passion. She was a princess, a pawn in the grand game of European politics. At 15, she had been promised to Prince Arthur, the eldest son of King Henry VII of England. He was a handsome young man, with the golden hair and striking blue eyes that had made him the talk of the English court. Yet, to Catherine, Arthur was a stranger. He was a boy she had only met in letters and portraits, a boy whose name she had known long before his face. She had no illusions about her role in the marriage, to cement an alliance. to unite two powerful kingdoms under one banner. The first time she laid eyes on him in person, she was struck by the fact that he looked nothing like the boy she had imagined. Arthur was taller than she had expected, but his demeanor was shy, almost distant. It wasn't the grand romance she had been told about in the fairy tales of her childhood. The wedding ceremony, though beautiful, felt like a formality, a stepping stone to an unknown future. And yet, as Catherine entered the marriage, there was a quiet sense of duty, of honor. She had come to England to secure her family's legacy, and she would fulfill that promise, whatever it took. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Arthur's death, barely 6 months after their marriage, left Catherine in a state of shock. She had been a young bride, full of hopes and dreams, but now she was a widow, her heart heavy with grief. The court, however, did not mourn for her in the same way they mourned for the prince. There were whispers that the marriage had never been consummated, that Arthur had never truly been able to fulfill his duties as a husband. Some said that he had been too sickly to perform his royal obligations, that their union had been nothing more than a fleeting moment of ceremony. These rumors quickly reached the ears of her father, Ferdinand of Aragon. It was he who first suggested that Catherine should marry her late husband's younger brother, Henry, the second son of King Henry VII. This would keep the alliance intact and ensure that Catherine's position in England remained secure. Catherine, though devastated by the loss of Arthur, found herself compelled by duty and honor to agree to this new arrangement. She would marry Henry, a man she had barely known, but whose future as King of England seemed increasingly certain. Henry, now a young man, was different from his late brother. He was not the delicate, frail figure that Arthur had been, but a robust and charismatic prince, full of energy and life. His early days were spent in the indulgence of royal luxury, surrounded by music, hunting, and the pursuit of pleasures that a young man of his station might expect. But Henry was also intelligent and ambitious. He saw himself not merely as a figurehead, but as a ruler in his own right. There was something magnetic about him that drew others to him, particularly women. When Catherine and Henry were married in 1509, it was not the union of two strangers, as their first marriage had been, but the beginning of something much more complicated. Catherine, still mourning her first husband, found herself both emotionally and physically distant from Henry. Despite the lavish courtship, Henry's attention was drawn to the promises of a new world. He was eager to prove himself, to become the king he had always dreamed of, not just a figurehead overshadowed by his father's legacy. But as much as he sought glory in battles and tournaments, there was an ache inside him that refused to be quelled. That ache had a name. Anne Boleyn, a young lady-in-waiting to Catherine, entered the royal court in the spring of 1525. She was everything that Catherine was not: youthful, vibrant, and unashamed of her beauty. Her charm was undeniable, and soon, Henry found himself captivated by her wit, her intelligence, and the daring way she carried herself. But it wasn't just her charm that drew Henry in. It was the fire that burned within her, a fire that would change everything, and had been in England for some years. Having spent time at the courts of the Netherlands and France, she had learned the art of diplomacy, of how to influence men, of how to navigate the intricacies of royal politics. Anne's beauty was not the conventional kind. It was more subtle, more enigmatic. She had a certain way of looking at Henry with her dark eyes, full of secrets that made him feel as though she saw through him, beyond the mask of the king, into the man beneath. For Henry, the affair with Anne was both a revelation and a temptation. He had always loved Catherine in his own way, but that love had begun to feel like an obligation, something that was expected of him rather than something that came naturally. With Anne, he felt a wild, uncontrollable passion, a connection that stirred something deep inside him. She represented everything Catherine could not: youth, vitality, and the possibility of a new beginning. And yet, in the deepest corners of his heart, Henry knew what he was doing was dangerous. For her part, did not see herself as a mere mistress, a transient lover in the king's bed. She saw herself as a woman with a destiny, a woman who could change the course of history. Her ambition was matched only by her beauty, and she was determined to win Henry's heart, no matter the cost. But she also understood that in a world where royal marriages were matters of political necessity, she could not afford to be content with being the king's mistress. She had to become his queen. By 1527, the tension in the English court was palpable. Catherine, now the Queen of England, had failed to produce a male heir. Despite her many pregnancies, her only surviving child, Mary, was a girl, and Henry's desperation for a son had grown unbearable. It was during this period of mounting frustration that Henry, in the solitude of his chambers, began to question his marriage to Catherine. He had long ago come to believe that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. His failure to produce a male heir was seen as a sign of divine displeasure. The guilt he felt for turning away from the God-ordained marriage to his brother's widow gnawed at him. But the arrival of Anne Boleyn gave him the chance to break free from this perceived curse. Aware of the growing shift in Henry's affections, began to push him toward a bold decision, the annulment of his marriage to Catherine. It was a dangerous move, one that would not only challenge the power of the Pope but also undermine the very foundation of England's relationship with Rome. But for Henry, the choice was clear. His desire for Anne, and for a son, outweighed his loyalty to his wife. In the summer of 1527, Henry began the process of petitioning the Pope for an annulment. The political and religious implications of this request would send shockwaves through Europe. The Church's response was slow, as Pope Clement VII, a man who was at the mercy of powerful forces in Italy, was unable to give Henry the satisfaction he sought. And so, Henry turned to more drastic measures. He was willing to risk everything: his throne, his kingdom, his soul for Anne Boleyn. The great matter, as it came to be known, began as a whisper in the English court but quickly grew into a tempest that consumed everyone in its path. Catherine of Aragon, once secure in her role as queen and confidant to King Henry VIII, now found herself at the center of a storm that threatened not only her marriage but also her legacy, her faith, and her very identity. It began with Henry's subtle withdrawal from her presence. The warmth that had once existed between them had cooled, replaced by long silences, curt conversations, and the ever-growing shadow of Anne Boleyn. Catherine, astute and perceptive, saw the change in her husband long before others did. Henry, once devoted to her, now seemed distracted, his mind consumed by desires he could no longer hide. For Catherine, the betrayal was not merely personal but sacred. She had been Henry's wife for more than 2 decades, his partner in all things, and the mother of his surviving child, Mary. She had endured miscarriages, stillbirths, and the heartache of losing infants who had lived only days. Through it all, she had remained steadfast, her faith in God and her duty to the crown unshaken. To Catherine, her marriage to Henry was ordained by divine will. It was unbreakable, sanctified by both their vows and the blessing of the Pope himself. But now, that sacred bond was being questioned, not just by her husband but by the very court she had helped shape. The rumors reached her first in half-spoken sentences, in the nervous glances of courtiers who could not meet her eye. Anne Boleyn had risen to prominence in Henry's affections, a fact Catherine could no longer ignore. The young woman, with her dark eyes and quick wit, had become a constant presence in the king's life. Catherine had watched from the sidelines as Anne flirted and laughed, her influence over Henry growing with each passing day. It was not merely Anne's beauty that captivated the king, but her ambition and the promise of something new, a chance to rewrite the future of England with a son by his side. Catherine, however, refused to yield. She was a queen, a daughter of the Catholic monarchs of Spain, and the wife of Henry VIII by both law and divine decree. Her defiance was not born of pride but of deep conviction. She believed with all her heart that her marriage was valid, that the hardships she and Henry had faced were trials sent by God to test their resolve. When Henry first broached the subject of an annulment, Catherine stood firm. She reminded him of their shared vows, of the love they had once held for each other, and of the loyalty she had shown him throughout their marriage. "I am your true wife," she told him, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her, "and I will not stand aside." Henry, frustrated by Catherine's refusal to comply, began to take more drastic measures. He enlisted the help of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, his trusted advisor, to secure the annulment. Wolsey, a man of great ambition and political acumen, sought to appeal to the Pope, arguing that Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid due to her previous union with Arthur, Henry's late brother. The argument hinged on a passage from Leviticus, which stated that a man who married his brother's wife would be childless. To Henry, this was proof that his marriage was cursed, that his failure to produce a male heir was a sign of God's disfavor. Catherine, however, countered this argument with unwavering resolve. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a claim supported by her sworn testimony and that of others who had been close to her during that time. She appealed directly to the Pope, urging him to uphold the sanctity of her marriage and to resist the king's demands. Catherine's faith in the Church was unshakable, and she believed that justice would prevail. As the months turned into years, the great matter became a bitter and public dispute. The court was divided, with factions forming around the Queen and Anne Boleyn. Catherine's supporters admired her dignity and strength, while Anne's allies championed her youth and the promise of a new era. The tension was palpable, and the court became a battlefield of whispers and intrigues. Every gesture, every word, was scrutinized, and loyalty was tested at every turn. Catherine's defiance only fueled Henry's determination. He began to distance himself from her, both emotionally and physically. He ordered her to leave the royal court, sending her to live in increasingly remote and less comfortable residences. Despite these humiliations, Catherine refused to relinquish her title as queen. She continued to refer to herself as Henry's lawful wife and to fight for her marriage with every ounce of her strength. The people of England, too, were drawn into the conflict. Catherine, with her piety and devotion, had won the hearts of many. She was seen as a true queen, a symbol of stability and faith in a time of great uncertainty. On the other hand, was viewed by many as an interloper, a woman who sought to usurp the queen's rightful place. The tension between the two women became a reflection of the larger struggle within the kingdom, a struggle that pitted tradition against change, loyalty against ambition. As the battle for the annulment raged on, Catherine faced her greatest challenge yet. The Pope, caught between the demands of Henry and the political pressures of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, delayed his decision. The stalemate only deepened the divide between Catherine and Henry, and the once loving couple became bitter adversaries. Henry, driven by his desire for Anne and his need for a male heir, began to take matters into his own hands. In 1531, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively severing ties with Rome. This bold and unprecedented move marked the beginning of the English Reformation, a seismic shift that would alter the course of history. For Catherine, it was a devastating blow. She had fought tirelessly to uphold the sanctity of her marriage and the authority of the Catholic Church, only to see both torn apart by her husband's ambition. Despite her losses, Catherine remained resolute. She continued to fight for her marriage, not out of bitterness or spite, but because she believed it was the right thing to do. Her faith in God and her unwavering sense of duty gave her the strength to endure the indignities heaped upon her. Even as she was isolated from the court and her daughter, Mary, was declared illegitimate, Catherine held her head high. Her final years were marked by sorrow, but also by a quiet dignity that earned her the respect of even her enemies. She wrote letters to Henry, pleading for the chance to see her daughter and to be restored to her rightful place as queen. But Henry, now fully consumed by his love for Anne and his desire for a son, refused. The once great love between Catherine and Henry had turned to ashes, and the kingdom they had built together was now divided. Catherine of Aragon died on January 7th, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle. She was 50 years old. Her death marked the end of an era, but her legacy endured. She had been a queen of great strength and faith, a woman who had fought for her beliefs in the face of insurmountable odds. Though she had lost the battle for her marriage, she had won the hearts of her people, who remembered her as a true and noble queen. As news of Catherine's death reached the court, Henry was said to have shown little emotion, and Boleyn, now pregnant with the child who would become Elizabeth I, reportedly rejoiced. But the shadow of Catherine's legacy would linger, a reminder of the cost of ambition and the power of faith. The court of King Henry VIII had long been a theater of intrigue, filled with grand displays of wealth, power, and ambition. But now, as Anne Boleyn's influence grew and Catherine of Aragon's position weakened, it was beginning to feel like a place of quiet warfare, where every gesture, every word, was scrutinized for signs of loyalty or rebellion. Henry had, for all his power, become a man divided, torn between his love for Anne and his commitment to his queen, Catherine. But even as Catherine fought to preserve her marriage and her dignity, there were forces beyond the walls of the palace that sought to challenge not just her place at court, but her very faith. For years, Catherine had trusted in the authority of the Catholic Church, placing her hopes in Rome to shield her from the king's increasingly insistent demands. But Henry, feeling the weight of his desires pressing against him, had begun to see Rome as a mere obstacle to his ambitions. If Catherine was unwilling to release him from their marriage, then he would find a way to make it happen himself. He had already dismissed the advice of his counselors, whose warnings against such a dangerous course fell on deaf ears. Instead, Henry sought the counsel of his friend, Thomas Cromwell, a man whose ambition matched his own. Cromwell's proposals, radical though they were, would alter the course of English history. Cromwell, with his sharp mind and ruthless determination, had begun to explore ways in which Henry might dissolve his marriage to Catherine without facing the wrath of the Pope. He suggested that Henry might claim his marriage had never been valid in the first place, a legal maneuver that would allow him to marry and without the stain of adultery. To this end, Cromwell persuaded Henry to present a case to the Vatican, arguing that Catherine's previous marriage to Henry's brother, Arthur, had invalidated her marriage to the king. It was a strategy fraught with peril. To question the legitimacy of Henry and Catherine's marriage would be to question not only the king's authority, but the very foundations of the church itself. Yet, Henry, desperate for a son and consumed by his obsession with Anne, pressed forward, determined to find a way to marry her. Catherine, for her part, was unyielding. The queen had lived through enough betrayal to know what was at stake. She had, over the years, grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her through the halls of court. She knew that many believed her to be a barren woman, incapable of giving Henry the male heir he so desperately craved. But Catherine, even now, could not believe that God had meant for her marriage to be annulled. It was an affront to everything she had stood for, a denial of the vows she had made in the eyes of God. The news that Henry had taken and as his mistress had cut her deeply, but she had endured it in silence, believing that her faith in God would see her through. Yet now, as Henry moved toward the idea of annulling their marriage, Catherine knew she would have to act. She could not simply sit idly by as her world crumbled. Her pride, her honor, and the future of her daughter, Mary, all depended on her refusal to bow to Henry's will. Catherine's struggle became a personal one, a matter of faith and identity. The question at hand was not just whether she could keep her marriage intact, but whether she could maintain her dignity as queen and her commitment to her religion in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Each day, Her hope was tested by the cruel whispers of her enemies and the intransigence of her husband. Henry, for all his rage and frustration, had never been a man willing to easily abandon what he had claimed as his. But as Catherine's resistance grew stronger, so too did his determination to remove her from his life. His court, once filled with the sounds of joy and revelry, now hummed with the tense anticipation of change. Catherine, having been raised a devout Catholic, placed her trust in the sacred bond that had been sealed between her and Henry. She believed, deeply and profoundly, that the marriage could not be undone by earthly desires. But she was up against a king who was not only willing to defy the church, but who also had the power to create a new one. England's future hung in the balance, torn between the old loyalties to Rome and the birth of something new, the Church of England. And at the center of it all was Catherine of Aragon, a queen unwilling to relinquish her throne, her marriage, or her faith. She fought not just for her place at Henry's side, but for the future of her daughter, Mary, who had been born into a world where everything was uncertain. The battle between Henry and Catherine grew more public, their personal lives spilling out into the halls of Westminster, into the chambers of the Vatican, and into the pages of history. As Henry's passion for Anne Boleyn intensified, Catherine's resolve hardened. She became not just a queen trying to hold onto her crown, but a woman defending the very essence of her identity. Meanwhile, stood on the sidelines, waiting, watching. She knew what was at stake. She had, in her own way, fought for her place in Henry's heart. But she also knew that the king's desire for her could be just as fleeting as his love for Catherine. If Henry succeeded in casting aside his wife, Anne would become queen, but it would come at the expense of Catherine's pain, her sacrifice, and the breaking of their sacred vows. As the battle for the crown intensified, the court of Henry VIII became a place where loyalty was constantly tested, where the strength of the human heart was pushed to its limits. And as Catherine's defiance grew, she knew that whatever the outcome, her life would never be the same. The world around her was changing, and she had to decide whether to stand firm and face the storm or yield to the tide of fate. The decision to seek an annulment was not a simple one. It was a declaration of war, not just against the Pope, but against the very foundations of the Christian faith that had guided England for centuries. For Henry VIII, however, it was the only way forward. His obsession with Anne Boleyn had grown so intense that no matter the cost, he was determined to have her as his queen. His longing for Anne, which had started as a mere dalliance, had become an all-consuming passion, one that overshadowed everything else. But this was not just a private matter of love and desire. It was political, theological, and deeply personal. Henry's decision would have consequences that rippled across the English kingdom and beyond its shores. As Cromwell worked tirelessly to find legal loopholes and arguments to convince both the English court and the people that Henry's marriage to Catherine was invalid, Anne Boleyn continued to rise in prominence. She was no longer just a mistress in the shadows, but a force in her own right. An ambitious woman who was more than willing to manipulate the situation for her own benefit. While Henry's mind was consumed with his desire for her, and used her charm and intellect to further secure her position in his court, all while promoting the idea of a new, reformed church that would suit Henry's purposes. With her sharp wit and defiance of traditional expectations for women, was a revolutionary figure in a time of great upheaval. She became Henry's rock, his confidant, and his secret weapon in his battle against Rome. Yet, even as Henry and Anne plotted the downfall of Catherine's marriage, the queen herself fought with a fierce determination to keep her place at the throne. Catherine of Aragon, never one to retreat from a battle, had always seen her marriage to Henry as ordained by God. Their union had been sanctified by the Pope, and no earthly power could undo what had been blessed in heaven. Catherine's faith, despite the mounting pressure, did not falter. She knew that Henry's desire for Anne was not only personal but political. To him, Anne was the answer to his pressing need for a male heir, something that Catherine, despite her devotion, had failed to provide. She had given him a daughter, Mary, but Henry's obsession with a male successor was the driving force behind his actions. Catherine's resistance was not merely a defense of her marriage, but a fight for her daughter's future. As long as her marriage to Henry remained intact, Mary would remain the legitimate heir to the English throne. If Henry annulled their union, their daughter's legitimacy would be called into question, and Anne's child, should she bear him a son, would be seen as the rightful heir. Catherine's position, however, was precarious. She had the support of many loyal nobles, but the weight of Henry's desire and the growing influence of Anne were undeniable. The court, which had once been a place of unity, was now divided, torn between the queen who had stood by her king for over 2 decades, and the ambitious mistress who was determined to take her place. As the months passed, the tension within the court became palpable. Henry, once so fond of Catherine, now treated her with coldness and distance, as if she were a relic of a bygone era. On the other hand, was present at all the grand events, her beauty and wit captivating Henry with each passing day. The lovers' private meetings, once discreet and hidden from the public eye, were now an open secret. The court, filled with whispers and half-hidden smiles, could only watch as the king's affections shifted from his longtime queen to the young woman who had captivated his heart. But Catherine, in her quiet dignity, refused to give in. She knew that her position was growing more fragile with each passing day, but she would not allow herself to be swept aside like a forgotten shadow. She had been a queen long before and had entered her life, and she intended to remain one, if not in title, then in spirit. In the midst of this turmoil, Catherine turned to her faith for solace. She prayed fervently for guidance, seeking the comfort of her religion and the wisdom of the Holy Scriptures. She held firm to the belief that her marriage had been consecrated by God, and that it could not be undone by the whims of men. She also sought counsel from the closest allies she had left, those who remained loyal to her cause. Among them was her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose support she hoped would help to turn the tide in her favor. Charles V was a powerful figure in Europe, the ruler of a vast empire that stretched across much of Europe and the Americas. His influence in Rome could be critical in challenging Henry's growing defiance of papal authority. As Catherine's supporters rallied behind her, they called for intervention from the Pope, urging him to defend the sanctity of her marriage and denounce Henry's actions. However, Pope Clement VII, caught in the political crossfire between the Emperor and the King of England, found himself in an impossible position. The Pope's hesitations only fueled Henry's resolve. No longer willing to wait for the papacy's verdict, Henry took matters into his own hands, taking the unprecedented step of breaking with the Catholic Church. He would establish a new church in England, one where he would be the supreme authority, where the power of Rome would be replaced by the power of the crown. This decision was as radical as it was dangerous, for it not only challenged the Pope's authority but threatened to shake the very foundations of Christendom itself. With the backing of Cromwell and his other advisors, Henry moved forward with his plan. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. The Pope's authority in England was null and void. This bold act was not only a declaration of independence but a direct challenge to Catherine's authority as queen. Now, Henry was free to marry and to make her his queen without interference from Rome. Anne Boleyn, the ambitious and determined woman who had captured Henry's heart, was now the queen-in-waiting. As she awaited the day when Henry would finally marry her, the stage was set for a new chapter in the history of England. But the consequences of Henry's decision were far-reaching, and the world would soon witness a kingdom divided not just by politics, but by faith, loyalty, and love. Catherine's fight was not over. The battle for the crown, for the throne, and for the future of England was far from won. It was only just beginning. Catherine of Aragon was no stranger to hardship, but this new fight, the battle for her marriage and her dignity, was one that she could not afford to lose. The years had worn her down, physically and emotionally. Her once immaculate health had begun to falter under the strain of endless miscarriages, her body failing to provide Henry with the male heir he so desperately craved. But still, Catherine clung to her faith, to her sense of duty as queen. She could not, would not, accept that her marriage to Henry, which had been sanctioned by the Pope himself, could be undone by mere whim. As Henry's obsession with and deepened, Catherine found herself increasingly isolated. The royal court, once a place where she had held great influence, now seemed hostile, its courtiers either silently siding with Henry or openly flaunting their allegiance to Anne. Anne's supporters were vocal and numerous, and their presence in the court became a constant reminder of what Catherine had already lost. Her most trusted allies, including several of her ladies-in-waiting, had begun to defect, enticed by the power and favor that Anne seemed to possess in abundance. The weight of the situation was crushing. Catherine could feel the walls closing in on her, but she refused to yield. The pressure mounted, and her resolve began to show signs of strain. Catherine wrote letters to her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, asking for his intervention. She knew that her power was limited to her standing in England. Without the backing of Rome and the emperor, her position was precarious. But despite her desperate pleas, her situation grew more dire with each passing day. Henry, with Cromwell's assistance, had begun to take decisive steps toward breaking with Rome entirely. It was not only Catherine's marriage that was on the line. The very authority of the Pope was being challenged. By 1533, Henry VIII had moved beyond legal petitions. The king, determined to secure Anne as his queen, had already secretly married her. Despite still being married to Catherine, this was the ultimate betrayal, one that left Catherine stunned and devastated. The annulment she had fought so hard for was already a fait accompli in Henry's eyes. He was now openly disregarding the sanctity of their marriage and had declared Anne pregnant with his child. Catherine, however, would not bow to the pressure. She publicly refused to acknowledge the annulment. Her letters to Henry became increasingly bitter as she made her case. "I am the true Queen of England," she wrote in one such missive, "the wife of your youth, the one who shared your bed and your heart for all these years." But Henry was unmoved. His obsession with and who had, in many ways, become the idealized woman he could not ignore, rendered any appeals from Catherine futile. Now crowned Queen Anne Boleyn stood beside Henry in all matters, and her grip on him seemed unshakable. Catherine's isolation was complete. She was no longer permitted to attend court or take part in royal affairs. Her supporters were few, and those who dared to question the king's decision were soon silenced, whether by bribery, exile, or worse. Yet, Catherine's resilience in the face of humiliation continued to inspire those who remained loyal to her. It was clear that this was no longer just a matter of the king's lust for Anne. It had become a war of wills, a contest of power and authority that threatened the future of the English crown. As the years passed, Catherine's health, already fragile, began to deteriorate further. The emotional toll of the events that had unfolded, her public disgrace, the loss of her queenly status, and the cruel treatment she had endured from her husband and the court, all began to take a heavy toll. But even as she faced these personal tragedies, Catherine's sense of justice never wavered. She continued to write, to send letters to those who would listen, never admitting defeat. She was still the rightful queen in her eyes, and in the eyes of many of the common people who had once adored her. Meanwhile, Anne's reign, still young, was filled with uncertainty. Though she had finally secured Henry's love, it became increasingly clear that Anne's own position as queen was precarious. Her failure to produce a male heir, despite the birth of her daughter Elizabeth, soon began to erode her status. Anne's beauty and sharp wit had won Henry's affection, but her inability to provide him with the longed-for son had turned the king's desires toward the next potential bride. The ghosts of Catherine's shadow still loomed large over the court. and the tension between the two queens, one exiled in her own home and the other on a fragile throne, could be felt throughout the land. For now, however, Catherine had been cast aside. She spent her days in relative isolation, away from the splendor of the court and from the husband she had loved for so long. But she never stopped fighting, never stopped believing that one day, the truth of her marriage would come to light. By the winter of 1532, the rift between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon had widened beyond repair. What had started as a personal desire for a male heir and a longing for Anne Boleyn had transformed into a larger political and religious revolution that threatened the very fabric of Christendom. The king's heart had irrevocably shifted, and now it was the entire English church that was in the balance. Anne Boleyn, who had once seemed a mere mistress in the shadow of royal power, had now become Henry's queen in all but name. She had won his heart, and with her fiery resolve and sharp intellect, she had also managed to secure a place at the center of his court and of his future. But Anne's rise to power had not been without its cost. In the eyes of many, she was a seductress who had stolen the king's affections, a woman who had torn apart a long-standing marriage and led England into a bitter confrontation with the Pope. It was clear that Henry had no intention of backing down. In his mind, he was the supreme ruler of England, and his desire to marry Anne was no longer a matter of personal love. It was a political necessity. The Pope, Clement VII, had repeatedly refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, citing both the sanctity of the original union and the fact that Catherine had been Henry's brother's widow, a fact that raised questions of legitimacy. But Henry, unwilling to accept the Pope's decision, now turned to a path of open rebellion. With her own desire for power and position, became an instrumental part of the unfolding revolution. She supported Henry's break from the Roman Catholic Church, using her own influence to encourage him to defy papal authority. The two of them, united in their ambition, turned their eyes toward the future. Anne's greatest wish was to secure the crown for her own children, and she believed that once Henry had married her, she would be able to bear him a son who would ensure the Tudor dynasty's continued strength. But Catherine, resolute as ever, refused to accept the divorce. She still saw herself as Henry's rightful wife, the Queen of England, and she would not relinquish that title easily. She withdrew from public life, refusing to attend court and choosing instead to live in the relative isolation of her estates. Yet, even in her exile, Catherine's strength and dignity became legendary. She wrote letters to the Pope, to her nephew Charles V, and even to Henry himself, pleading for her rights. She appealed to the very core of English law and tradition, insisting that her marriage to Henry was valid, and that their daughter, Mary, had the rightful claim to the throne. For Catherine, the struggle had become a matter of personal pride and the preservation of her legacy. She was no longer just a queen fighting for her marriage. She was a woman of unwavering faith, standing in defiance of a king who had chosen to rewrite history in his favor. But her position was becoming increasingly untenable. Henry, with the support of his ministers, had already begun to break away from Rome, declaring himself the head of the Church of England, free from papal authority. The Act of Supremacy was passed by Parliament in 1534, formally declaring Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. This law not only gave him the power to annul his marriage to Catherine, but also allowed him to marry Anne. It was a bold and historic move, one that would forever change the religious landscape of England. But for Catherine, it felt like a death sentence. The dissolution of her marriage was now a legal reality, sanctioned by the very laws of the land. But Catherine was not yet willing to accept defeat. She held on to the title of queen. Even if the court had increasingly abandoned her, she continued to resist, refusing to acknowledge Anne's rise to queenly status. Her defiance and her loyalty to her faith would continue to resonate for years to come. Meanwhile, now pregnant with what would later be Elizabeth I, felt the weight of her new role as Henry's wife, the very wife who had caused the kingdom to fracture and the church to break. The years following Henry VIII's break with Rome were marked by turbulence, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of the lives at the center of the storm. What had begun as a love triangle between Henry, Catherine, and Anne had now transformed into a saga of political upheaval and personal tragedy. The decisions made by Henry, driven by desire and ambition, had set in motion events that would forever change England. But for those closest to him, the consequences were deeply personal and, ultimately, devastating. Catherine of Aragon, once the proud Queen of England, spent her final years in isolation, stripped of her title and separated from her daughter, Mary. Catherine was sent to live at Kimbolton Castle, far from the court and the life she had once known. Despite the indignities heaped upon her, Catherine remained steadfast in her faith and her belief that she was Henry's true wife. She continued to write letters, pleading for the chance to see her daughter and to restore her position. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Henry, consumed by his new life with Anne and the demands of his kingdom, refused to grant her even this small mercy. Catherine's health began to deteriorate rapidly under the weight of her grief and the harsh conditions of her exile. By 1536, she was gravely ill. On January 7th of that year, she passed away, alone but resolute, still calling herself Queen of England until the very end. News of her death reached Henry and Anne, and while the court publicly celebrated the passing of a woman they saw as an obstacle, there were whispers that Henry showed a fleeting moment of regret. For Anne, Catherine's death was a victory, but one that would soon feel hollow. Anne Boleyn, who had fought so hard to become queen, was now facing her own struggles. Though she had been crowned and had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, she had failed to produce the male heir that Henry so desperately desired. Her sharp tongue and fiery temperament, once seen as assets, now grated on the king. The love that had once burned so brightly between them began to flicker and fade. Henry's wandering eye had turned to Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, and Anne could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. The court, ever a place of intrigue and betrayal, began to conspire against Anne. Her enemies, jealous of her influence and eager to win favor with the king, began to spread rumors of infidelity and treason. Henry, eager to rid himself of the wife who had failed him, was all too willing to believe these accusations. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and high treason, though the charges were almost certainly fabricated. The outcome was inevitable, and Boleyn was tried before a jury of her peers. But the verdict had been decided long before the trial began. On May 19, 1536, she was executed by beheading at the Tower of London. As she climbed the scaffold and maintained her dignity, addressing the crowd with grace and courage, "I am the king's faithful wife," she declared, "and I pray for his long life and for his soul." Her death marked the end of an era, but her legacy would live on through her daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. Henry, for all his power and determination, was left with little to show for the sacrifices he had made. His kingdom had been torn apart by religious conflict. His marriages had ended in tragedy, and the male heir he had sought for so long remained elusive, though he would go on to marry for more times. None of his relationships would ever match the passion and drama of his unions with Catherine and Anne. In the end, the love triangle that had reshaped England was not one of triumph but of loss. Catherine's unwavering faith, Anne's fierce ambition, and Henry's relentless desire had collided in a way that left no one unscathed. The fallout from their choices would echo through history, shaping the future of England and the lives of generations to come. Henry VIII would die in 1547, leaving behind a fractured kingdom and a complicated legacy. Catherine's daughter, Mary, would briefly reign as queen, her rule marked by religious persecution and attempts to restore Catholicism to England. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, would rise to power after Mary's death, ushering in the Elizabethan Age, a golden era of prosperity and cultural achievement. In the end, it was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who would secure the Tudor dynasty's place in history. The story of Henry, Catherine, and Anne was one of love and betrayal, faith and ambition, but it was also a reminder of the human cost of power. Their lives, though filled with grandeur and drama, were ultimately shaped by the same desires and fears that have driven humanity for centuries. And as the dust settled on their tragic saga, England stood transformed, a kingdom forever changed by the choices of three people who could not escape the weight of their own passions.